This is the Jerry Doyle Show.
As much as they try to ignore him, Ron Paul, that is, they can't seem to do it. Politico, will Ron Paul kill the caucuses? That's Iowa. That's January 3rd. There's a lot of interesting hits on Congressman Paul here. Even though there's no evidence of an organized effort to try and rig the election, that didn't stop Iowa House Speaker Craig Paulson saying, well, I don't think, perverting the process in that fashion helps. I'm not saying that that's what they're doing. We have no evidence of what they're doing, but we're going to put it out there just so some people might think that's actually what Ron Paul and his supporters are doing. Joining us on the program to talk about what's happening on the ground, Jack Hunter, the Southern Avenger. He's the official campaign blogger for Ron Paul 2012, and also the co-author with Rand Paul of The Tea Party Goes to Washington. Mr. Hunter, welcome back.
Always good to be with you, Jerry. How you doing today?
I'm good. I read this article, and I'm looking at the Republican elites with the existential threat that tampering, losing the status of Iowa. The governor says ignore him. It's a threat to the beloved quadrennial franchise. I mean, if I was a McDonald's owner, I might say, okay, I get it. But we're talking about, hits coming from people in his own party.
Well, that's exactly right. And, the more success you have and the better you do, and the more that conservative message, that constitutional limited government message hits home with more voters and it shows in the polls, this scares the hell out of the GOP establishment. The comment you just cited is one. All the articles you're seeing, the knives are coming out for Ron Paul. Why? Because he's doing well. Because he might do well in Iowa, or better than people expected, or New Hampshire, and so on. And the GOP establishment cannot contend with their own hypocrisies. This big government Republican Party we put up with for so long, Ron Paul makes them look bad. And if he wins, it makes them look worse. And that's why you're seeing the pushback.
So I guess another thing that they're going to do is, Iowa schmiowa. Who cares about the Iowa caucuses anyway? So if Ron Paul happens to overachieve, which is one of the words that I've heard used, that we should dismiss the overachiever and downplay the results of Iowa. So they get a double whammy there. They can overachieve on one side and downplay the results on the other and dismiss it out of hand like Bill O'Reilly and CNBC and CBS did with poll results.
I've made the joke that if Ron Paul does get the White House, the entire media and GOP establishment will basically say, well, the presidency is irrelevant. We'll look at how Romney might reshape the party as we head into 2016. We won't pay attention. Now, that might be exaggerating a little bit, but not entirely. Look, if we were at 1 or 2% of the polls, they would say, well, why do we need to talk about Ron Paul? He's irrelevant. But when you're at the top of the polls, they say, oh, we are also irrelevant. Well, you can't have it both ways. Either people are starting to listen to this message, and it's catching on, and they're believing in it, and they're seeing a big difference between Ron Paul and all the other GOP candidates in terms of integrity and consistency and who's an actual constitutionalist through and through, or they're not, and they are, and that's why the poll numbers are going up. You're absolutely right, Jerry. I mean, to be as dismissive as they are, even at this late date, and not taking him more seriously, it's patently absurd on so many levels.
Does that at some point, Mr. Hunter, start to work to Congressman Paul's advantage? Because when the Democrats were beaten up constantly on George Bush, it was like somebody telling you got an ugly dog. I know it's an ugly dog. No, I mean, I know he is an ugly dog. And eventually you get to the point where you say, hey, knock it off. That's my dog, which is what the Republicans did with the attacks on Bush coming from the Democrats. Is this obvious and coordinated attempt to undermine Ron Paul's move in the polls going to backfire, where people are going to say, knock it off? And as a matter of fact, because I know you're going out of your way to dismiss him and to ignore him and to invalidate him, that I'm going to support him.
I think you're exactly right, Jerry. I've actually experienced that in my limited capacity as a conservative pundit at the Daily Caller and working in talk radio. Many of my conservative friends have listened to some of these other talkers in the conservative media. Heard one guy yesterday, the Big Show, talking about how nutty Ron Paul is, or how crazy or kooky. They don't really give an explanation. They just say these things. He's out of sorts in some sort of insulting way. Conservatives out there in the grassroots and the voting base of the GOP start to see through that. that. Maybe they weren't a Ron Paul supporter to begin with, but when they see the pylon, they recognize that these guys are scared of something, and it does have the opposite effect. You said, yeah, I know he's an ugly dog. It is that sort of effect. They see the pylon going on with Ron Paul, and they wonder why these people are so scared. It's one thing to have policy differences and to spell them out. It's another thing just to hurl insults at a candidate and leave it at that. For example, we keep hearing that Ron Paul is unelectable or crazy or kooky. Has anybody not paid attention to anything Newt Gingrich has said over the past few decades? I mean, honestly, you talk about a guy whose his temperament, as Ann Coulter even described it, is not fit for the White House. These same people who hurl insults at Ron Paul don't say that about Newt Gingrich. Why? Because they like Newt Gingrich, and they'll bend over backwards defending him. Ron Paul, who has been consistent, there is a constitutional philosophy that you can measure, outline, and define from beginning to end of his career. Well, no, they don't like that and dismiss it. It is transparent, it is silly, and I think more people than ever are saying that.
Consistent is a key, and on this program, Mr. Hunter, we talked about back on December 5th. How do you beat a consistent socialist, which is what Obama is? He's consistent. Nothing should be a surprise to anyone as to what he's doing: running roughshod over the Constitution, circumventing Congress's authority, signing executive orders, putting in mandates that don't pass the smell test. He's a consistent socialist, and if anything, Congressman Paul has been a consistent constitutionalist and a consistent conservative, and I would have to think that people who would be able to judge him on that consistency will say, at least I know what he's been about, what he stands for, and he hasn't changed it to meet the political winds to shift course to their own advantage. I think consistency goes a long way.
That's exactly right. And consistent socialist is certainly applicable to Barack Obama, and consistent constitutionalist is certainly applicable to Ron Paul. Think of it this way, Jerry. Let's look at the three front runners. We've got Ron Paul, we've got Newt Gingrich, and Mitt Romney. All right, you've got the consistent conservative, the consistent constitutionalist, and Ron Paul. Then you've got two guys. The most unpopular issue, one of the most unpopular issues with American voters right now is Obamacare. Nobody likes it, left, right, across the spectrum. You've got two guys, two candidates, who both have supported the individual health mandate, which is the most offensive part of Obamacare. Do we want the Republican nominee going into this race who's saying, Obamacare is going to be a big issue? Do we want the Republican nominee to be in support of the worst part in most Americans' minds of Obamacare? No, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And the idea that that's electable, but the guy who's been consistent is unelectable or out, it just doesn't make any sense no matter how you measure it.
Jack Hunter is with us. He's the official campaign blogger for Ron Paul 2012. The campaign website, ronpaul2012.com, southernavenger.com, Mr. Hunter's website. One of the issues that comes up outside of the knocks that Congressman Paul is kooky, he's crazy, and he's unelectable is the issue of age, that he's too old. Now, I want you to answer this from a couple of standpoints. Number one, the issue of Congressman Paul's age. But number two, Congressman Paul not necessarily being the be-all, end-all, but more the person who represents a movement that has to continue beyond the ultimate demise of Congressman Paul, as is everyone, because we don't live forever. How does this issue of age be addressed in regard to how it ties in with the issue of how the movement sustains?
I think it's an excellent and fair question. Let's look at the practical questions surrounding Ron Paul's age. He's 76 years old. For a lot of Americans, that would be the oldest American president. In other nations around the world, particularly in Europe, you have prime ministers and heads of state that are well into their 90s. It's happened plenty of times. It's just certainly new here in America. Age is usually attached to somebody's physical health. That is a concern, their mental and physical health. Well, anybody who supported Chris Christie for president early on, I don't want to hear any criticisms about health. If that guy had been the nominee, I think Ron Paul would be in a lot better shape going up against him. I agree with what Congressman Paul said. Anybody who has these concerns needs to go down to Texas and do a 20-mile bike ride in the sweltering heat this summer and see who comes out at the other end huffing and puffing and who doesn't. Ron Paul is the picture of health. He exercises avidly, like nothing more than riding his bicycle. I can tell you from firsthand experience. As far as his age and the overall movement, which is what you were talking about earlier, I would rather have a 150-year-old 30-year-old constitutionalist in the White House than a 30-year-old socialist, and I mean in a Democratic or Republican form. We have gone too far. This country has gone too far in the statist direction with our spending, the size of our debt, which keeps growing. Obama's grown it astronomically, that we have to go drastically back in the other direction. Well, who represents doing that? A guy like Newt Gingrich, who calls Ron Paul's $1 trillion in cuts a non-starter? A guy like Mitt Romney, who has no limited government record to speak of? No, the only choice, if you recognize, if you're a Tea Party or if you're a traditional conservative out there who recognizes that we drastically have to run in the other direction towards limited government, what other choice do you have in this race other than Ron Paul? There is no other choice. It's a no-brainer from top to bottom.
And imaging is also important. A lot of people don't have time to read your writings, which they can do at ronpaul2012.com, your blog, southernavenger.com, or read Politico. But they look at pictures. One of the pictures that I saw, you talk about Congressman riding a bike in 100 sweltering heat for 20 miles. One of the pictures on what is a Republican cheerleading outlet, the Drudge Report, had a picture of Congressman Paul on his bike in shorts. And the only other time I ever saw a picture like that was when they had the picture of Barack Obama on a bike. And it was, in my opinion, a smack at Congressman Paul to make him look Pee Wee Herman-esque to a certain degree. And there wasn't the traditional congressional picture that they put up. There wasn't one of the campaign appearances, shirt sleeves rolled up, engaging the public. This was designed by the Drudge Report to make that picture say something about Congressman Pee Wee Herman Paul.
Well, you can't put anything by any media, Drudge. You can't put anything, or trust them with anything. You know, everybody has their own agendas. I would compare that, Jerry, to National Review during this election cycle. Has put candidate Michelle Bachmann on their cover. They had Mitt Romney in the last cycle. They've had all these different candidates, Newt and others, and they feature them in a very positive light. Well, Ron Paul finally made the cover of National Review, and they made him look like an absolute nutcase. Is there an agenda behind that? I would imagine so, just like the picture you just cited or anything else. There's people in the media who have their own political agendas, and they fashion their own narrative accordingly. They do it visually with pictures. They do it with the things they say about these candidates. Those of us who are keen observers of this stuff can sort of read between the lines and make our own decisions.
But the Republicans rallied behind that picture of Michelle Bachmann, I believe it was Newsweek or Time or one of them, where she looked crazy. She was even asked by Chris Wallace, "Are you nuts?" or something like that. So everybody said, no, that was wrong. Even Chris Wallace apologized for what he said to Michelle Bachmann, but there doesn't seem to be any apologies, and not that apologies go a long way with me. Most people just use them as a get-out-of-jail card. But there doesn't seem to be that same kind of come to the aid of a fellow Republican when the attacks are taking place on Congressman Paul like they are.
That's exactly right. I actually had a lot of problems with that Michelle Bachmann cover, as did many people in the Paul camp. It was unfair. It was an unfair portrayal of her. And you're right, but many people came to her defense. People even on the left thought it was too much. They don't do that for Ron Paul. Why? Because the left fears him because he's a genuine constitutional conservative. You talk about limiting government, the left is scared to death of Ron Paul. But also the conventional Republican establishment. They don't like this guy either. As I said at the beginning of the interview, the Republican Party has spent money just as much of the Democrats, if not worse. Before President Obama was the biggest big government president in our history, George W. Bush was. And most of the Republicans running are completely fine with that Republican model. Ron Paul makes them look bad. He embarrasses them, so they don't mind just, he's a kook. This magazine cover says it, this picture says it, and they don't rush to his defense because they sort of share that view.
Got to wrap it up. Thanks, Jack Hunter. I appreciate your time on the program. The Southern Avenger, the co-author with Rand Paul of The Tea Party Goes to Washington. You can follow him at ronpaul2012.com, where he is the official blogger. And we'll see how this plays itself out between now and January 3rd. I look forward to getting back with you, Jack.
Jerry Doyle.
800-876-4123 is the numbers. Numbers on Wall Street when we get back. Big day, big rally. Stick with me.